Sometimes a child's heart sees what grown-up eyes cannot. When we lose someone we love, we think we know exactly what we need to feel whole again. In Cedar Ridge, recently widowed Vivian Ashford has it all figured out. She needs a new husband for herself and a father for 8-year-old Lily. 5 wealthy cowboys have come calling, each one more polished and prosperous than the last. But while her mother entertains these refined gentlemen, little Lily wanders toward the forest edge, where she meets Nathaniel Cross, a quiet mountain man who's been hiding from the world for 10 years. When Lily returns to point at this rough stranger and declares, "That one," everyone is shocked. What could a child possibly see in a man who lives alone in the mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany dresser as Vivian Ashford sat before her mirror, her fingers hovering over the small jewelry box that had remained unopened for 6 months. Inside lay her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had circled her finger for 12 years until that awful February morning when the doctor's words had changed everything. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashford. We did everything we could." She closed the box with a gentle click and turned her attention to the day ahead. The mirror reflected a woman of 32 who had learned to wear composure like armor. Her auburn hair was pinned in a practical chignon, her green silk dress pressed to perfection. Everything about her appearance spoke of control, of a woman who had her life firmly in hand. The truth was far more complicated. "Mama, are you coming down for breakfast?" Lily's voice drifted up the stairs, carrying that note of gentle patience that sometimes made Vivian's heart ache. At 8 years old, her daughter had developed a wisdom that seemed to extend far beyond her years, a wisdom born from loss that no child should have to carry. "I'll be right there, sweetheart," Vivian called back, smoothing her skirts one final time. Today was important. Today, she would begin the careful process of rebuilding their lives in a way that made sense, that provided security and respectability for both of them. The dining room downstairs gleamed with the kind of understated elegance that old money preferred. Mahogany furniture inherited from her grandmother, china that had been in the family for 3 generations, and silver that caught the morning light just so. Everything in its place, everything as it should be. Lily sat at the long table, her small frame dwarfed by the high-backed chair, picking at scrambled eggs that had gone cold while she waited. She looked up as Vivian entered, those grey eyes, so like her father's, studying her mother with an intensity that sometimes unnerved Vivian. "Mrs. Henderson came by while you were upstairs," Lily said, her voice carefully neutral. "She wanted to remind you about the social gathering this afternoon." Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Martha Henderson had been her late husband's business partner's wife, and she had appointed herself Vivian's unofficial advisor in all matters concerning proper widowhood. The woman meant well, but her constant suggestions about suitable remarriage prospects had begun to feel more like marching orders. Did she now? Vivian sat across from her daughter and poured coffee from the silver service. "And what did you tell her?" "That you were getting ready and would see everyone at 2 o'clock. Lily paused, setting down her fork. "Mama, do we really have to go? It feels like a cattle auction." The observation was so unexpectedly apt that Vivian nearly choked on her coffee. "Lily Marie Ashford, where on earth did you hear such a thing?" "I listen," Lily said simply. "People talk and they think children don't understand, but we do. Mr. Patterson was telling Mr. Hendricks yesterday that you needed a strong hand to guide you, and Mr. Morrison said you were prime stock that wouldn't stay on the market long." She wrinkled her nose. It sounded awful. Vivian set down her cup carefully, reminding herself that her daughter's honesty, while sometimes uncomfortable, was also refreshing in a world full of social niceties and hidden meanings. Lily, what people say and what I choose to do are two different things entirely. I'm considering remarriage because I think it would be good for both of us, stability, companionship, security. But what about love? The question was asked simply so directly that it cut straight through all of Vivian's careful reasoning. Love, Vivian began, then stopped. How did one explain to a child that love was a luxury she couldn't afford twice in one lifetime, that practical considerations mattered more than romantic notions when you were responsible for another person's future? Love is important, sweetheart, but so are other things. A good provider, someone who would be kind to you, someone who understands our position in the community. Lily nodded slowly, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Will you know him when you see him? The right person, I mean. The question lingered in Vivian's mind as they finished breakfast in companionable quiet. Would she know? She had known with James, had felt that instant recognition, that sense of rightness that poets wrote about and practical women were supposed to outgrow. But that was different. She had been 20 then, naive enough to believe that love conquered all difficulties. By afternoon, the Ashford parlor had been transformed into what Lily had accurately described as a showcase. Martha Henderson had arrived early to help arrange flowers and ensure that the refreshments were properly displayed. 3 other prominent wives from town had followed, each bringing their own opinions about which of Vivian's suitors showed the most promise. Bradford Morrison is clearly the front-runner, declared Helen Patterson, settling her considerable bulk into the best chair. His ranch is the largest in 3 counties, and he's never been married. You'd be his first wife, dear, not competing with memories. But he's 48, protested Agnes Caldwell. Perhaps someone closer to Vivian's age would be more suitable. Jerome Hartwell is only 35, and his shipping business is quite profitable. Martha Henderson waved a dismissive hand. Age is less important than character and stability. Now, Randolph Kincaid might not have the largest spread, but his bloodline is impeccable. His grandfather was a senator. Vivian listened to their debate with growing irritation, feeling very much like a prize heifer being discussed by potential buyers. These women meant well. She reminded herself of this repeatedly. But their casual disposal of her agency in the matter grated against every instinct she possessed. What about young Timothy Garrett? Helen suggested. He's handsome, certainly, and his father's banking interests would complement Vivian's inheritance nicely. Too young, Martha declared. 28 is barely past boyhood. Vivian needs a man, not a child playing at adulthood. The 5th name, Charles Whitman, brought nods of approval all around. A widower himself at 39, he had inherited both a successful cattle operation and a solid reputation for conservative business practices. He was, the ladies agreed, eminently suitable. As 2 o'clock approached, Vivian found herself studying her reflection once more, this time in the hall mirror. The woman looking back at her appeared calm, composed, ready to make sensible decisions about her future. But somewhere behind those green eyes lurked a small, rebellious voice that sounded remarkably like her 8-year-old daughter asking uncomfortable questions about love. The first to arrive was Bradford Morrison, exactly on time, bearing flowers that had clearly been purchased rather than picked. He was a large man, both in height and girth, with the kind of presence that dominated rooms through sheer physical mass. His conversation centered primarily on his cattle numbers and land acquisitions, delivered in the tone of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering. Jerome Hartwell followed 15 minutes later, precise and punctual, carrying himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned early that appearance mattered as much as substance. His discussion topics ranged from shipping schedules to market prices, all delivered with the focused intensity of a man who saw life as a series of profitable transactions. Randolph Kincaid arrived in a carriage that had seen better days, but still bore the family crest on its doors. His conversation was peppered with references to his family's political connections and social standing, though Vivian couldn't help but notice that these connections seemed to date primarily to his grandfather's era. Timothy Garrett brought youth and enthusiasm, along with flowers that he had clearly picked himself from some roadside meadow. His nervousness was both endearing and slightly exhausting. He seemed to view the afternoon as a test he was determined to pass through sheer effort and good intentions. Charles Whitman was the last to arrive, and perhaps the most comfortable. In the social setting, having navigated his own widowhood, he understood the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. His conversation included thoughtful questions about Lily's education and adjustment, recognizing that any marriage would involve more than just two adults. Throughout the afternoon, Lily moved quietly through the gathering, offering refreshments and listening with the kind of attention that adults rarely paid to children's observations. Vivian watched her daughter interact with each man, noting the polite distance she maintained, the way her responses never moved beyond basic courtesy. It was only when the conversation turned to plans for an upcoming community harvest festival that Lily showed any real interest. The men began discussing their expectations for the event, business opportunities to be explored, social connections to be reinforced, the importance of maintaining proper appearances. "Will there be music?" Lily asked during a brief lull in the conversation. Bradford Morrison laughed, a sound that seemed to emerge from somewhere around his considerable midsection. "Music is for dancing, child, and dancing is for younger folks, with more time for frivolity. There might be some musical entertainment," Jerome Hartwell added diplomatically, "though the primary focus should be on celebrating the harvest and strengthening community bonds." Randolph Kincaid nodded approvingly. "My grandfather always said that community events should serve a higher purpose than mere entertainment. Character building, you understand." Timothy Garrett looked as though he wanted to disagree, but lacked the confidence to contradict his elders. Charles Whitman simply smiled and said nothing, which Vivian found herself respecting more than the others' immediate opinions. As the afternoon wore on, Vivian began to feel a familiar sensation, the same suffocating politeness that had characterized so many social gatherings during her marriage to James. The difference was that James had understood her need for authenticity beneath the social veneer. He had known how to catch her eye across a crowded room and convey, with just a look, that they were partners in navigating the required performances of their social position. These men, for all their individual merits, seemed to view social conventions not as necessary performances, but as natural expressions of their true selves. The distinction felt crucial, though Vivian couldn't quite articulate why. When the last guest had departed and the parlor had been restored to its usual quiet elegance, Vivian found Lily curled up in the window seat, staring out at the mountains that ringed their valley. "What did you think of our visitors?" Vivian asked, settling beside her daughter on the cushioned bench. Lily was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing patterns on the glass. "They were all very polite," she said finally. "That's not really an answer, sweetheart. They were all trying very hard to impress you," Lily continued thoughtfully. "But I don't think any of them were trying to know you." The observation hit closer to home than Vivian cared to admit. "Sometimes knowing someone takes time, Lily. People aren't always comfortable showing their true selves right away." Daddy was. The words were spoken so softly they were barely audible. "You told me once that you knew he was special the first time you met him, because he asked you what you thought about things instead of telling you what he thought about things." Vivian's throat tightened. She had forgotten telling Lily that story, but the memory came rushing back. James at a church social, seeking her opinion about a local political issue, while other young men had been content to lecture her about their own views. "Your father was unusual in that way," Vivian managed. "Maybe unusual is better than normal," Lily suggested, still staring out at the mountains. "Maybe normal is just what people do when they're afraid to be themselves." As evening settled over, Cedar Ridge, Vivian sat alone in her study, reviewing the afternoon's events and trying to make sense of her conflicting feelings. Each of her suitors possessed qualities that should have impressed her: wealth, stability, social standing, decent character, yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire enterprise. Perhaps it was simply the strangeness of courtship after years of marriage. Perhaps she was expecting too much, hoping for lightning to strike twice in one lifetime. Perhaps Lily's romantic notions were infecting her own practical considerations, or perhaps her 8-year-old daughter possessed a wisdom that Vivian had forgotten in her determination to make sensible choices about their future. Outside her study window, the mountains stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, and somewhere in those hills lived people who had chosen paths different from the conventional routes that society prescribed. Vivian had heard stories, of course, tales of men who had withdrawn from civilization for reasons both tragic and mysterious. Most of the town's women spoke of such people with a mixture of pity and disapproval, viewing their isolation as evidence of moral failing or mental instability. But tonight, staring at those distant peaks, Vivian found herself wondering whether some people simply saw more clearly from a distance, whether stepping away from society's expectations might actually be a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. The thought was both intriguing and terrifying, and she pushed it firmly aside as she prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new social obligations, new conversations about her future, new pressure to make decisions that would satisfy everyone except, perhaps, herself. But as she drifted towards sleep, Lily's words echoed in her mind. Maybe unusual is better than normal. And for the first time in months, Vivian allowed herself to wonder whether her carefully constructed plans might not be the only path forward after all. The Harvest Festival arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Cedar Ridge look like a painting. Main Street had been decorated with cornstalks and pumpkins, and the smell of apple cider and fresh bread drifted from the booths that lined the thoroughfare. It was the kind of day that should have filled Vivian with contentment, but instead she felt increasingly trapped by the elaborate courtship dance that seemed to have taken over her life. All 5 of her suitors had arrived early, each determined to escort her through the festivities with varying degrees of proprietary confidence. Bradford Morrison had claimed the right to accompany her to the opening ceremonies, while Jerome Hartwell had reserved the lunch hour. The afternoon had been carefully parceled out among the others, with Charles Whitman securing the final escort. Duty for the evening's dance. Lily walked beside them through the crowd, her hand tucked dutifully into Vivian's, but her eyes kept drifting toward the forest that bordered the town's eastern edge. She had been unusually quiet during breakfast, and Vivian sensed that familiar restlessness that sometimes overtook her daughter during large social gatherings. "The harvest looks to be particularly good this year," Bradford was saying, his chest puffed with the kind of pride that suggested he personally controlled the weather. "My land alone produced nearly 30% more grain than last season. Good management, you understand, knowing when to plant, when to fertilize, when to harvest." Vivian nodded at appropriate intervals, but her attention was caught by the way Lily's grip on her hand had tightened. The child was scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the simple pleasures of a harvest celebration. "Are you looking for someone, sweetheart?" Vivian asked quietly. "Just wondering who else might be here," Lily replied, but something in her tone suggested deeper currents. The morning passed in a blur of introductions, congratulations on the community's prosperity, and carefully orchestrated conversations about the importance of strong leadership in uncertain times. By noon, Vivian's cheek muscles ached from maintaining a pleasant expression, and she found herself longing for a few minutes of solitude. Jerome Hartwell proved to be a more attentive companion than Bradford, asking thoughtful questions about Lily's schooling and showing genuine interest in her progress with reading and arithmetic. But even his considerate attention felt somehow performative, as though he were checking items off a mental list labeled proper courtship behavior. It was during the afternoon, while Randolph Kincaid was regaling them with stories of his grandfather's political career, that Lily finally slipped away. Vivian noticed her absence during a particularly long anecdote about senatorial voting procedures, and a quick scan of the immediate area revealed no sign of her daughter's blue dress among the crowd. "Excuse me?" Vivian interrupted, her voice sharper than social convention dictated. "I need to find Lily." Randolph paused mid-sentence, looking slightly affronted at the interruption. "I'm sure she's simply enjoying the festivities with the other children. Young ones do tend to wander." But Vivian was already moving, her maternal instincts overriding social politeness. Timothy Garrett fell into step beside her, his young face creased with concern. "I'll help you look," he offered, and for the first time all day his nervousness seemed to disappear in the face of a genuine need. They searched the main festival area systematically, the game booths, the food stalls, the areas where other children had gathered to play. With each passing minute, Vivian's anxiety grew. Lily was not a child given to wandering off without purpose, and her earlier restlessness now seemed more significant. "Mrs. Ashford," called Agnes Caldwell from near the apple-bobbing station, "I saw Lily walking toward the forest path about 20 minutes ago. I assumed she was with you." The forest path. Vivian's heart clenched as she remembered the way her daughter's eyes had kept drifting toward those trees all morning. The path led up into the hills, where respectable people rarely ventured, where stories spoke of hermits and mountain men who preferred isolation to civilization. Timothy proved surprisingly resourceful in organizing a search party, though Vivian noticed that Bradford Morrison and Jerome Hartwell seemed more concerned about maintaining their social obligations than joining the effort. Charles Whitman, however, immediately abandoned his afternoon appointments to help, and even Randolph Kincaid set aside his dignity long enough to assist. The forest path was well-worn but narrow, winding upward through stands of pine and aspen that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns. Vivian's practical boots were not designed for hiking, but maternal fear drove her forward at a pace that left her companions struggling to keep up. They had climbed for nearly 30 minutes when the sound of voices drifted down from ahead, Lily's clear soprano mixed with a deeper, unfamiliar rumble. Vivian's relief was so intense that she nearly stumbled, but it was quickly replaced by apprehension about what her daughter might have discovered in these isolated hills. The path opened into a small clearing where a log cabin sat nestled against the hillside, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, straight line. A workshop area had been set up under a rough lean-to, and it was there that Vivian found her daughter sitting cross-legged on a tree stump, watching with rapt attention as a man shaped wood with a draw-knife. The man looked up as the search party approached, and Vivian felt her breath catch. He was not what she had expected from the town's whispered stories about the mountain hermit. Tall and lean, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His clothes were simple but clean, and his hands, currently holding a piece of partially carved wood, showed the calluses of honest work. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth of sadness that seemed to echo her own grief. This was a man who understood loss, who had retreated from the world not out of misanthropy, but out of pain too deep for casual healing. "Mama!" Lily jumped up from her perch, her face bright with excitement. "This is Mr. Cross. He's been teaching me about wood carving, and look what he made." She held up a small wooden horse, exquisitely carved with flowing mane and lifted hooves that seemed to capture motion in stillness. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the work of someone with both skill and infinite patience. "I hope you don't mind," the man, Nathaniel Cross, said quietly, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone unaccustomed to frequent conversation. "She appeared at my workshop like a curious woodland creature. I couldn't very well turn her away without ensuring she was safe." "You've been very kind." Vivian replied, though she was acutely aware of the disapproving murmurs from the men behind her. Timothy Garrett seemed more curious than judgmental, but the others were clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Lily has been telling me about your family," Nathaniel continued, his gaze meeting Vivian's with surprising directness. "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing a father is difficult at any age." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without flowery sympathy or uncomfortable platitudes, touched something in Vivian that had been carefully protected since James's death. This stranger understood the weight of grief in a way that her well-meaning suitors, for all their good intentions, seemed unable to grasp. "We should return to the festival," Bradford Morrison interrupted, his tone carrying clear disapproval. "People will be wondering where you've gone, Vivian." But Lily had moved closer to Nathaniel's workbench, studying the various pieces in different stages of completion. "Do you live here all by yourself?" she asked, with the direct curiosity that only children could manage without giving offense. "I do," Nathaniel replied seriously. "Sometimes solitude is what a person needs to make sense of life." "My mama thinks she needs people around to make sense of life," Lily observed. "But I think maybe both ways work, depending on the person." The wisdom in the child's words seemed to surprise everyone, including Nathaniel, who smiled for the first time since they had arrived. The expression transformed his features completely, revealing traces of the man he must have been before whatever tragedy had driven him to these hills. "You may be right," he told Lily gently. "Perhaps the important thing is knowing which way works best for you." As they prepared to leave, Nathaniel pressed the carved horse into Lily's hands. "A gift," he said simply, "to remember that beautiful things can come from patient work, even when the world seems harsh." The walk back to town was accomplished in relative silence, though Vivian was acutely aware of the tension radiating from her companions. Bradford Morrison's disapproval was palpable, while Jerome Hartwell seemed to be calculating the social implications of the encounter. Even Charles Whitman appeared troubled, though his concerns seemed focused more on Lily's safety than on any perceived impropriety. Only Timothy Garrett seemed genuinely interested in what they had discovered. "He's quite skilled," he ventured, as they reached the festival grounds. "That carving was museum quality." "Skill with wood doesn't translate to suitability as company for respectable families," Bradford replied curtly. "Mountain hermits are mountain hermits for good reason." But Vivian found herself barely listening to their debate. Her mind kept returning to the moment when Nathaniel Cross had acknowledged her loss with such simple understanding, and to the way Lily had seemed to blossom in his presence like a flower, finding unexpected sunlight. As they rejoined the festival, Lily clutched her wooden horse and looked back toward the mountains with an expression that Vivian recognized all too well. It was the same look her daughter had worn when she asked uncomfortable questions about love and authenticity, the look of someone who had glimpsed something true in a world full of careful pretenses. The evening dance proceeded as planned, with Charles Whitman proving to be a considerate partner and pleasant company. But throughout the music and laughter, Vivian found her thoughts drifting to a quiet cabin in the hills where a lonely man carved beauty from wood and understood the weight of grief without trying to minimize its importance. When the festivities finally ended and they returned home, Lily placed her wooden horse carefully on her bedside table before turning to face her mother with solemn eyes. "Mama," she said quietly, "I know you think you need to marry one of those men for practical reasons, but what if practical isn't the same as right?" The question hung in the air long after Lily had fallen asleep, and Vivian lay awake wondering whether her carefully constructed plans were leading her toward security or simply toward a different kind of loneliness. The gossip began before the festival decorations had been taken down. By Monday morning, it seemed that every respectable woman in Cedar Ridge had an opinion about Vivian Ashford's daughter wandering off to visit that mountain man, and none of those opinions were particularly charitable. Martha Henderson arrived for morning tea without invitation, settling herself in the parlor with the determined air of someone preparing to deliver difficult truths. "Vivian, dear, we need to discuss what happened on Saturday. People are talking." "People always talk, Martha." Vivian poured tea with studied calm, though her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the silver pot. "I fail to see how my daughter's brief adventure constitutes a matter of public concern." "A brief adventure?" Martha's eyebrows rose nearly to her carefully arranged hairline. "She disappeared for nearly an hour to visit a man who hasn't set foot in civilized society for a decade. Do you have any idea what that does to your reputation, to your prospects?" From the hallway came the soft sound of footsteps pausing. Lily, no doubt listening to yet another adult conversation about her transgression. Vivian kept her voice deliberately level, aware that her daughter would be absorbing every word. "My daughter got lost during a crowded festival and was helped by a kind stranger," Vivian said firmly. "I fail to see the scandal in that." "Kind stranger?" Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Vivian, that man is practically a savage. He lives alone in those hills like some sort of wild creature. Heaven knows what kind of influences. He carved her a wooden horse." The words came out more sharply than Vivian had intended. "He was gentle with her, respectful to me, and showed more genuine kindness in 10 minutes than—" She stopped herself before saying something that would damage relationships beyond repair. But Martha caught the implication anyway. "Than your suitors? Vivian, you cannot be serious. Those men are offering you security, status, a proper future for yourself and Lily. This mountain man offers nothing but questions about your judgment." After Martha left, her mission clearly unsuccessful, Vivian found Lily in the garden, sitting beneath the old oak tree with her wooden horse cradled in her lap. The child looked up as her mother approached, and Vivian was struck once again by the unsettling wisdom in those grey eyes. "Are you in trouble because of me?" Lily asked directly. Vivian settled on the grass beside her daughter. "Propriety be damned." "You're not in trouble, sweetheart, but some people think—" She paused, searching for words that would convey the social complexities without burdening a child with adult anxieties. "Some people think we should only associate with certain types of people. People like Mr. Morrison and Mr. Hartwell. People who fit into our world easily," Vivian said carefully. Lily was quiet for a moment, turning the wooden horse over in her small hands. "But what if our world isn't the right size for us anymore?" The question hit Vivian like a physical blow. Since James's death, she had focused entirely on fitting back into the world they had known together, on maintaining the social position he had worked so hard to establish. It had never occurred to her that perhaps that world was no longer adequate for who they had become. The afternoon brought Bradford Morrison, arriving without appointment and clearly expecting immediate attention. He found Vivian in her study, reviewing household accounts, and settled himself in the chair across from her desk with proprietary confidence. "I felt it was important to address Saturday's incident directly," he began without preamble. "As someone who hopes to have a significant role in your future, I believe certain boundaries need to be established." Vivian set down her pen and regarded him with cool attention. "What sort of boundaries?" "Regarding appropriate associations for you and your daughter. That mountain man is not a suitable influence for a child of Lily's breeding. If we are to move forward with a formal arrangement, I need assurance that such episodes will not be repeated." The casual assumption that he had any right to dictate her behavior or her daughter's associations sparked a flare of anger that Vivian struggled to contain. "Mr. Morrison, we have not yet reached any formal arrangement, and even if we had, I would not consider my daughter's safety and happiness to be subject to negotiation." Bradford's face darkened. "Safety? That hermit could be dangerous, unstable. Men don't withdraw from society without reason, and those reasons are rarely admirable." "He showed my daughter nothing but kindness," Vivian replied firmly. "More kindness, frankly, than she has received." from some supposedly civilized members of our community. The meeting ended awkwardly, with Bradford's departure carrying undertones of ultimatum that left Vivian both angry and unsettled. She was beginning to understand that marriage to any of her suitors would involve more than partnership. It would require submission to their ideas about proper behavior, proper associations, proper life. That evening, as she tucked Lily into bed, her daughter surprised her with a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Mama, do you think Mr. Cross is lonely?" Vivian smoothed the coverlet, considering her answer carefully. "I imagine he might be, sweetheart. Living alone in the mountains must be very quiet." "He didn't seem lonely when he was carving," Lily observed. "He seemed peaceful, like he was exactly where he belonged." "Some people find peace in solitude," Vivian agreed. "And some people find peace in company," Lily continued thoughtfully. "But what happens when the company doesn't bring peace anymore? When it just brings noise?" The observation was so astute that Vivian felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "All. Those men who come to visit, they make a lot of noise about how they can take care of us and give us things we need. But they don't make you smile the way Daddy did. They don't make you look peaceful." That night, Vivian lay awake thinking about peace, when she had last felt it, what it might cost to find it again. The safe path forward was clear. Choose one. Of her suitors, accept the security and social approval that came with a conventional marriage. Raise Lily within the boundaries of respectable society. But Lily's words echoed in her mind. What if our world isn't the right size for us anymore? The next morning brought Jerome Hartwell, ostensibly to discuss a business proposal, but clearly motivated by the same concerns that had driven Bradford's visit. He was more diplomatic in his approach, but the underlying message was the same. Association with mountain hermits was incompatible with the kind of marriage he envisioned. "I hope you understand my position," he said carefully as their conversation concluded. "A man in my position requires a wife whose judgment is above reproach." Saturday's incident raised questions that would need to be resolved before we could move forward. After he left, Vivian found herself standing in her study, staring at a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. Herself and James on their wedding day, young and radiant, with the confidence that love could conquer any obstacle. They had been wrong about many things, but not about the importance of choosing one's own path, even when that path defied convention. The photograph seemed to mock her current situation, where she was allowing fear and social pressure to guide decisions that would affect the rest of her life and her daughter's future. James would have been appalled at the idea of choosing a husband based on other people's approval rather than her own judgment. But James was gone, and she was left to navigate these treacherous waters alone, carrying responsibility not just for her own happiness, but for Lily's security and future prospects. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, particularly when complicated by a growing suspicion that the safe path might not lead to safety at all, only to a different, more subtle kind of prison. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her study floor, Vivian made a decision that surprised even herself. Tomorrow, she would visit Nathaniel Cross's cabin, not as part of a search party, not accompanied by disapproving suitors, but as herself, seeking answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. The walk to Nathaniel's cabin seemed longer when undertaken deliberately, rather than in panicked pursuit of a missing child. Vivian had told herself she was going to thank him properly for his kindness to Lily, but as the forest path wound higher, into the hills, she acknowledged more complex motivations. She needed to understand what her daughter had seen in this stranger, what quality he possessed that had sparked such immediate trust. The morning air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and Vivian pulled her shawl tighter as she climbed. She had left Lily with Martha Henderson, claiming household errands that required privacy, and the deception sat uncomfortably on her conscience. But some conversations needed to happen away from 8-year-old ears, particularly when those conversations might challenge carefully constructed assumptions about appropriate behavior. The sound of an axe biting wood echoed through the trees. As she approached the clearing, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat, she paused at the forest edge, studying the scene before her, with eyes unclouded by emergency or social pressure. Nathaniel Cross worked with the efficient grace of someone who had found purpose in simple tasks. His movements were economical, practiced, and there was something almost meditative about the way he split logs with precise, measured swings. He had removed his shirt in the warming sun, and Vivian found herself noting the lean strength of his shoulders, the way his body moved with unconscious confidence. He sensed her presence before she announced herself, turning with the alertness of someone accustomed to solitude. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the clearing, a proper widow and a mountain hermit, separated by more than physical distance. "Mrs. Ashford," he reached for his shirt, pulling it on with matter-of-fact courtesy. "I wasn't expecting company." "I wanted to thank you properly," Vivian said, stepping into the clearing, "for your kindness to Lily. The wooden horse has become her most treasured possession. She's a remarkable child, old soul in a young body." Nathaniel set his axe aside and gestured toward a rough bench near his workshop. "Would you care to sit? I can offer you water, though I'm afraid my hospitality doesn't extend much beyond that." Vivian accepted the seat gratefully, her practical boots having proved less than ideal for mountain hiking. From this closer vantage point, she could see the careful organization of his workspace, tools maintained with precision, wood sorted by type and purpose, everything in its proper place. This was not the chaotic environment of a man who had lost his grip on civilization, but rather the ordered domain of someone who had deliberately chosen simplicity. "Lily has been asking questions," she said carefully, "about loneliness, about peace, about choosing the right path forward. I think your conversation affected her more deeply than I initially realized." Nathaniel settled on a stump across from her, his dark eyes studying her face with uncomfortable directness. Children often understand things that adults have forgotten. They haven't yet learned to distrust their instincts. "And what do you think her instincts told her about you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the mountains that rose beyond his clearing. "Perhaps that I'm not dangerous, despite what your townspeople might believe. Perhaps that sadness doesn't automatically make someone broken beyond repair." The simple honesty in his words touched something raw in Vivian's chest. "Are you broken beyond repair?" "Some days I think so," he admitted. "Other days I remember that broken things can still serve a purpose, even if they can't be made whole again." The conversation was straying into territory that proper social conventions would have forbidden, but Vivian found herself hungry for this kind of direct communication after weeks of careful dancing around subjects that mattered. "May I ask, what brought you here, to this life?" Nathaniel's hands stilled on the piece of wood he had been unconsciously shaping. "I had a family once. A wife, 2 children, a boy and a girl not much older than Lily. There was a fire." His voice remained steady, but Vivian could see the cost of the words in the tightness around his eyes. "I was away on business. By the time I returned, there was nothing left to save." The stark simplicity of his grief hit Vivian like a physical blow. She understood now why her daughter had responded to him so immediately. He carried loss with the same careful dignity that Lily was learning to manage, the same refusal to pretend that devastating sorrow could be quickly overcome. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the conventional words feeling inadequate but necessary. 10 years, he continued, his fingers resuming their careful work on the wood. 10 years of trying to make sense of why I survived when they didn't. The first few years, I wanted to join them. But eventually I realized that honoring their memory meant continuing to live, even if that life looked different than anything I had planned. Is that why you stayed here in isolation? Partly, but also because I discovered that solitude offers clarity that society often obscures. When you strip away all the expectations and conventions and social requirements, you can finally hear what your own heart is trying to tell you. Vivian found herself thinking of her morning routine, the careful attention to appearance, the social obligations, the constant awareness of what others expected from a widow of her position. "And what has your heart told you?" Nathaniel looked up from his carving, meeting her eyes directly. "That healing takes whatever time it takes, that there's honor in simple work done well. That sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that the life others expect you to live isn't the life you need." The words hung between them like a challenge. Vivian thought of Bradford Morrison's ultimatums, Jerome Hartwell's requirements, the careful negotiations that would accompany any conventional marriage she might make. "Lily asked me something yesterday," she said slowly. "She asked what happens when the company you keep doesn't bring peace anymore, when it just brings noise." Wise question. What did you tell her? I didn't know how to answer. But sitting here now, I think I'm beginning to understand what she meant. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from practical matters, how he sustained himself, what skills he had developed in isolation, to deeper questions about purpose and contentment. Nathaniel had been a teacher before his tragedy, she learned, and his cabin contained more books than she would have expected. He read voraciously, carved furniture that he occasionally traded for supplies, and had developed a profound understanding of the natural world around him. More importantly, he listened to her thoughts about widowhood, about the pressures of rebuilding a life while grieving the old one, about the complexity of making decisions that would affect Lily's future. He offered no advice, made no judgments, simply heard her words with the kind of attention that had become rare in her daily life. When she finally prepared to leave, Nathaniel disappeared into his cabin and returned with a folded piece of paper. "I started writing this years ago," he said, pressing it into her hands. "A letter to my family, trying to explain things I never had the chance to say. I never sent it, obviously, but writing helped me process feelings that were too large for my mind alone." Vivian looked down at the yellowed paper, feeling the weight of shared trust. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because sometimes we need to understand that others have walked similar paths and survived. Because your daughter saw something in me that reminded her of strength rather than weakness, and because—" He paused, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Because I haven't enjoyed a conversation this much in 10 years, and I wanted you to understand that you're not as alone as you might feel." The walk back to town felt like a journey between worlds. As the familiar buildings of Cedar Ridge came into view, Vivian felt the weight of social expectations settling back onto her shoulders like an unwelcome cloak. But she also carried with her the memory of genuine conversation, of being heard without judgment, of glimpsing the possibility that healing might take forms she had never considered. That evening, as Lily played contentedly with her wooden horse, Vivian sat in her study and carefully unfolded Nathaniel's letter. The words revealed a man of depth and education, someone who had wrestled with profound questions about faith, purpose, and the meaning of loss. But more than that, they revealed someone who had found a way to continue living with intention and dignity despite devastating circumstances. When Lily appeared in the doorway, already dressed for bed, Vivian quickly folded the letter away. "How was your day, Mama?" "Enlightening," Vivian replied honestly. "I think I'm beginning to understand some things that I hadn't seen clearly before." Lily climbed onto her mother's lap, settling against her with comfortable familiarity. "About what?" "About the difference between being safe and being happy, about the importance of listening to our own hearts instead of always worrying about what others think. Does that mean you might make different choices than the ones everyone expects?" Vivian tightened her arms around her daughter, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "It means I'm going to try very hard to make choices that honor what we both need, even if those choices surprise people, even if they surprise us." "Especially then," Vivian said softly. "Sometimes the best choices are the ones that frighten us a little, because they mean we're growing beyond who we used to be." The packet of flower seeds arrived with the morning mail, wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine. There was no return address, but Vivian recognized the careful script that had penned her name. Inside, she found seeds for mountain. Wild flowers, hardy varieties that could bloom even in difficult conditions, along with a brief note for spring planting. Sometimes beauty grows best in unexpected places. N.C. Lily discovered the package while helping sort the mail and immediately understood its significance. "He remembers that I told him about your garden," she said, examining the seed packets with reverence. "He said these flowers are stronger than the fancy ones because they know how to survive winter." The gift was both touching and problematic. Vivian could imagine the scandal if word spread that she was receiving presents from the mountain hermit, however innocent their nature. Yet as she held the seeds, she found herself thinking about resilience, about finding ways to flourish despite harsh conditions. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Whitman, who had requested a private conversation about their mutual interests. Unlike her other suitors, Charles had not demanded immediate explanations about the festival incident, but his silence on the subject had felt more ominous than Bradford's bluster or Jerome's ultimatums. "I've been thinking about our situation," he began once they were seated in the parlor, "about the challenges facing a woman in your position and the delicate balance required to maintain both personal happiness and social standing." Vivian waited, recognizing the careful diplomacy that had made Charles successful in both business and his previous marriage. "I believe I understand why Lily's choice of companion might have appealed to her," he continued. "Children are drawn to authenticity, and mountain life certainly offers that in abundance. But authenticity without context can be dangerous, particularly for a young girl who needs to understand her place in civilized society." "And what do you believe that place should be?" Charles smiled, the expression managing to be both warm and calculated. "Protected, guided, surrounded by influences that will prepare her for the responsibilities that come with her station in life. Surely you agree that her future depends on learning to navigate social expectations successfully." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, Charles presenting his vision of marriage as a partnership designed to provide security and respectability for all involved. He spoke eloquently about shared responsibilities, compatible goals, and the importance of presenting a united front to the community. Everything he said was reasonable, practical, and utterly bloodless. After he left, Vivian found herself in the garden, staring at the patch of earth where she had once grown roses. With James, the soil had been neglected since his death, and weeds had claimed the space where careful cultivation had once produced beauty. It struck her that her life had followed a similar pattern, neglecting the parts of herself that had once flourished in favor of simply surviving each day. "Mama!" Lily appeared at her elbow, having approached with the silent stealth that children mastered when sensing adult distress. "Are you thinking about Daddy?" Among other things. Vivian knelt beside the abandoned flower bed, her fingers sifting through soil that felt cold and lifeless. "I was remembering how much joy he found in growing things, how patient he was with plants that took time to establish themselves. He used to say that the most beautiful flowers were the ones that looked impossible at first," Lily recalled, "like they were too delicate to survive. But then they surprised everyone by being stronger than anything else in the garden." The memory hit Vivian with unexpected force. James had indeed said exactly that, usually while tending to some struggling seedling that had looked doomed to failure. His garden had been full of such unlikely survivors, plants that thrived precisely because they had learned to adapt to difficult conditions. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Timothy Garrett, who arrived looking unusually troubled. Unlike her other suitors, Timothy seemed less concerned with advancing his own interests than with addressing something that was clearly weighing on his conscience. "Mrs. Ashford, I felt I should tell you about a conversation I overheard yesterday," He began without preamble. Bradford Morrison was speaking with some of the other men about your situation. The discussion was not particularly charitable. Vivian felt her stomach tighten. What sort of discussion? He's been suggesting that your judgment has been compromised by grief, and that perhaps community intervention might be necessary to protect Lily's interests. He's also been spreading stories about the mountain man that seemed designed to paint him in the worst possible light. The implications were clear and frightening. In a town like Cedar Ridge, where social approval could determine everything from business prospects to children's educational opportunities, being branded as a woman of questionable judgment could have devastating consequences. What sort of intervention? She asked carefully. Timothy's discomfort was obvious. Nothing official, you understand, but there's been talk about approaching your late husband's family, suggesting that perhaps Lily would benefit from a more stable environment while you work through your personal difficulties. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. James's family had never fully approved of their marriage, considering Vivian's background slightly beneath their own social aspirations. They had maintained polite distance since his death, but Vivian had no illusions about their willingness to interfere if they believed such interference might benefit their social standing. Timothy, why are you telling me this? He met her eyes directly, and she saw in them a moral struggle that spoke well of his character. Because I don't believe that a woman's worth should be determined by her willingness to accept other people's choices for her life, because I've seen how happy Lily is when she's allowed to be herself, and I've seen how that happiness disappears when she's forced to perform for adults who don't really see her. His words resonated with uncomfortable truth. Vivian had indeed noticed how Lily seemed to diminish herself during formal social occasions, becoming the polite, subdued child that society expected rather than the bright, curious person she was. In more natural settings, there's something else, Timothy continued. I took the liberty of making some inquiries about Nathaniel Cross. Discreet inquiries, you understand. He's not what people think he is. What do you mean? He was a professor before his tragedy, philosophy and literature at the university in Denver, published several papers on educational theory, lost his family in a house fire while he was delivering a lecture series in another state. Timothy paused, as if weighing whether to continue. He inherited considerable wealth from his father-in-law's mining interests, but he's never touched it. Been living off the land and occasional trading for 10 years. The revelation added new layers to Vivian's understanding of the man who had shown such kindness to her daughter. A professor who had walked away from wealth and position, not out of failure, but out of grief so profound that nothing in his former life held meaning anymore. Why are you sharing this information with me? Because I think you deserve to make decisions based on truth rather than gossip, and because, Timothy's young face flushed slightly, because I've been watching you try to force yourself into a shape that doesn't fit, and it's painful to see someone diminish themselves to meet other people's expectations. That evening, as Vivian tucked Lily into bed, her daughter surprised her with an observation that seemed to come from nowhere. Mr. Garrett is different from the other men who visit, Lily said thoughtfully. He talks to me like I'm a real person, instead of just somebody's daughter. He is a kind young man, Vivian agreed, but you don't love him. The statement was delivered with matter-of-fact certainty that left no room for polite deflection. Lily, love is complicated. No, it isn't, Lily interrupted gently. Love is simple. Everything else is complicated. Love is just seeing someone exactly as they are and wanting them to be happy, even if their happiness looks different from what you expected. As Vivian prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about her daughter's definition of love, about the difference between simple truth and complex social maneuvering. She thought about the packet of wildflower seeds sitting on her kitchen table, chosen by someone who had seen her abandoned garden and understood the possibility for new growth. Most of all, she thought about courage, the courage to plant seeds. that might not survive, to choose paths that frightened her, to trust that authenticity might be stronger than safety. Outside her window, the mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and somewhere in those hills lived a man who had chosen truth over convenience, solitude over false companionship, the hard work of healing over the easier path of pretending that devastating loss could be quickly overcome. For the first time since James's death, Vivian found herself wondering not what choice would satisfy others, but what choice would allow her to sleep peacefully, knowing she had honored both her own heart and her daughter's wisdom. Vivian's second visit to Nathaniel's cabin was prompted by necessity rather than curiosity. Lily had developed a persistent cough that seemed to worsen each night, and Dr. Henley's prescribed remedies had proven ineffective. Martha Henderson had mentioned, almost reluctantly, that the mountain man was known to have considerable knowledge of herbal medicine, a skill that had helped several townspeople during difficult times, though few his assistance. The November air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter as Vivian climbed the familiar forest path, this time with Lily bundled beside her despite the child's protests that she was well enough to stay home. The cough that had prompted their journey seemed worse in the thin mountain air, and Vivian found herself questioning the wisdom of bringing a sick child into the wilderness. But as they approached the clearing, the scent of wood smoke and something else, something medicinal and soothing, drifted through the trees. Nathaniel was waiting for them, as if he had somehow sensed their approach, and his immediate focus on Lily's labored breathing dispelled any awkwardness about seeking help from someone her suitors would consider unsuitable. "How long has she been coughing like this?" he asked, guiding them toward his cabin with gentle urgency. "Nearly a week," Vivian replied. "It gets worse at night and nothing seems to help." Inside, the cabin revealed itself to be far more comfortable and well-appointed than external appearances suggested. Books lined one wall. A stone fireplace provided warmth that seemed to penetrate straight to the bones, and everywhere Vivian looked, she saw evidence of a mind that had not abandoned intellectual pursuits despite physical isolation. Nathaniel settled Lily in a chair near the fire and disappeared into what appeared to be a small adjoining room. He returned with a collection of dried herbs and a kettle that he hung over the flames with practiced efficiency. "This is quite different from what I expected," Vivian admitted, studying the cabin's unexpected refinements. "Most people expect hermits to live in caves, I suppose," Nathaniel replied with gentle humor. "But comfort and solitude aren't mutually exclusive. I may have left society, but I never abandoned the belief that environment shapes both thought and healing." As the herbal mixture steeped, filling the cabin with aromatic steam, Lily's cough began to ease. Nathaniel pulled a piece of unfinished wood from a shelf and began carving while they waited, his hands moving with unconscious grace as he shaped what appeared to be a small bird. "You're very skilled," Vivian observed, watching the delicate details emerge under his patient knife. 10 years of practice," he said simply. "When you have nothing but time, you discover what your hands can learn to do. Do you miss it? Your previous life?" Nathaniel paused in his carving, considering the question with the careful attention he seemed to give all inquiries. "I miss my family every day, but the life I lived before, the university, the social obligations, the constant pressure to publish and advance and compete, I'm not sure I was ever truly suited for it. Perhaps tragedy simply gave me permission to admit what I had always suspected about myself, which was that I was trying to be someone else's version of who I should be rather than discovering who I actually was." Lily, breathing more easily now in the herbal-scented air, looked up from the cup of tea Nathaniel had prepared for her. "That's what Mama's been doing too," she said with the devastating honesty that children wielded like surgical instruments. "Trying to be what everyone thinks a widow should be, instead of just being herself." The observation hung in the air like a challenge. Nathaniel continued carving, but Vivian could feel his attention shift to her response. "Sometimes being ourselves isn't practical," she said carefully. "Sometimes we have responsibilities that require us to adapt. Or sometimes we're afraid that if people see who we really are, they might not approve." Lily countered gently. "But if they don't approve of who we really are, then their approval isn't worth very much, is it?" Nathaniel smiled at this wisdom, setting aside his carving to tend the fire. "Your daughter has a philosopher's mind," he told Vivian. "She asks the questions that matter most and refuses to accept convenient answers." As Lily's breathing continued, to improve, the conversation turned to books, education, and the kind of learning that happened outside formal institutions. Nathaniel's cabin was indeed a treasure trove of literature and philosophy, and his isolation had clearly not dulled his intellectual curiosity. "I've been teaching myself astronomy," he mentioned, gesturing toward a collection of star charts spread across a rough table. "When you live without the interference of town lights, the night sky becomes remarkably clear." "Could you show us?" Lily asked, perking up with renewed energy. As evening settled over the mountains, Nathaniel led them to a small clearing behind his cabin, where the sky opened up like a vast dome studded with brilliant points of light. He had constructed a simple platform with benches arranged to facilitate sky watching, and his knowledge of celestial movements proved as extensive as his understanding of herbal medicine. "That's Cassiopeia," he explained, pointing toward a distinctive, W-shaped constellation. "And there, just rising over the eastern peaks, is Orion beginning his winter journey across our sky." Lily was entranced, asking question after question about the stories behind the star patterns, about the distances involved, about whether people on other worlds might be looking back at them. Nathaniel answered each inquiry with patience and genuine enthusiasm, clearly delighted to share knowledge with someone so eager to learn. Vivian found herself watching him more than the stars, noting the way his face animated when discussing subjects that captured his imagination, the gentle authority with which he guided Lily's curiosity, the complete absence of condescension in his explanations. This was teaching in its purest form, knowledge shared for the joy of sharing rather than for any practical advantage. The ancient Greeks believed that the stars were holes in the heavens, Nathaniel told Lily, places where the light of eternity shone through the darkness of our world. "Do you believe that?" Lily asked. "I believe that beauty and mystery are essential to human happiness," he replied thoughtfully, "and that anyone who stops looking up at the night sky has forgotten something important about wonder." When they finally prepared to leave, Nathaniel pressed a small bundle of herbs into Vivian's hands, along with careful instructions for brewing tea that would help Lily's cough continue to improve. He also gave Lily the carved bird he had been working on, a delicate swallow with wings spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. "For courage," he explained simply. "Swallows migrate thousands of miles every year, trusting their instincts. To guide them home." The walk back to town was accomplished mostly in comfortable silence, Lily's breathing noticeably easier and her spirits lifted by the evening's discoveries. But as the lights of Cedar Ridge came into view, Vivian felt the familiar weight of social expectation settling back onto her shoulders. "Mama," Lily said as they approached their house, "why do people think that living differently means living wrongly?" The question captured something Vivian had been struggling to articulate about her own situation. "I think some people find it threatening when others make choices that challenge what they believe is the only right way to live." "But there can't be only one right way," Lily protested. "People are too different for that to work." "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. But recognizing that truth and having the courage to act on it are two different things." That night, as Lily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Vivian sat in her study reviewing the evening's revelations. She had seen Nathaniel in his own environment, witnessed the life he had constructed from loss and solitude, and been forced to acknowledge that his withdrawal from society had produced not bitterness or stagnation, but a different kind of growth. More troubling was her recognition that the man who lived alone in the mountains understood her daughter better than any of the suitors who claimed to want a role in their lives. He had seen Lily's intelligence and curiosity as gifts to be nurtured, rather than qualities to be shaped according to social convenience. The carved swallow sat on her desk, its wooden wings frozen in eternal flight toward some distant destination. Vivian found herself wondering whether courage meant choosing the safe path that everyone expected, or whether it meant trusting her instincts to guide her towards something that might look impossible from a distance, but could prove surprisingly strong once she had committed to the journey. The revelation came through Timothy Garrett, who arrived at Vivian's door on a crisp December morning, carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with profound confusion. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to speak with you about something extraordinary," he began without preamble, settling himself in the parlor with unusual urgency. "Yesterday I was at the county courthouse researching property boundaries for my father's ranch expansion when I discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Nathaniel Cross." Vivian set down her teacup, noting the unusual intensity in Timothy's voice. "What sort of discovery?" Timothy opened his satchel and withdrew a collection of official-looking documents. Property deeds, mineral rights assessments, geological surveys, all bearing Nathaniel's name. "Mrs. Ashford, that mountain hermit owns more than 3,000 acres of prime territory, including the richest silver deposits in the entire region." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Vivian stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had assumed about Nathaniel's circumstances. "Are you certain these are accurate?" "I had the clerk verify them twice," Timothy replied, spreading the papers across her coffee table. "According to these records, Nathaniel inherited the land from his late wife's father, a mining entrepreneur who discovered the silver deposits but died before they could be properly developed. The geological surveys estimate the value at somewhere approaching $500,000. $500,000. The sum was staggering, particularly when contrasted with the simple cabin, the hand-carved furniture, the herbs gathered from mountain meadows. Vivian thought of her careful calculations about security and financial stability, about the necessity of choosing a husband who could provide adequate material support. "But he lives so simply," she murmured, more to herself than to Timothy. "That's what makes this so extraordinary," Timothy continued, his young face animated with the implications. "He's choosing to live as he does. It's not poverty or failure that drove him to the mountains. It's genuine preference for that kind of life." As Timothy departed, promising to keep the discovery confidential until Vivian could decide how to proceed, she found herself grappling with a fundamental shift in perspective. The man she had begun to care for, and she could no longer deny that her feelings had moved well beyond gratitude or mere interest, was not the impoverished hermit that social convention had painted him to be. By afternoon, news of the discovery had somehow leaked into Cedar Ridge's gossip network with the kind of speed that suggested Timothy's promise of discretion had been overly optimistic. The first indication came when Bradford Morrison arrived unannounced, his demeanor noticeably different from their previous encounters. "Vivian, my dear," he began with an oily charm that made her skin crawl, "I've just heard the most fascinating news about our mysterious mountain neighbor. Perhaps we've all been too hasty in our judgments about suitable associations." The complete reversal in his attitude would have been comical if it hadn't been so revealing of his true character. Within hours, Jerome Hartwell appeared with similar newfound enthusiasm for getting to know all members of our community better, and even Randolph Kincaid managed to discover pressing business that required him to pass by Vivian's house and share his revised thoughts about the importance of not judging by appearances. Only Charles Whitman maintained his previous position, though his reasoning proved equally troubling in its own way. Wealth doesn't automatically confer respectability, he argued during his evening visit. A man who chooses to live like a hermit, despite having the means for proper society, clearly suffers from some form of mental instability. Such eccentricity might be even more dangerous than simple poverty. Lily listened to these shifting allegiances with the kind of sharp attention that missed nothing important. That evening, as Vivian tucked her into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been hovering unspoken all day. Does knowing about the money change how you feel about Mr. Cross? Vivian considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would carry weight beyond the immediate conversation. It changes how I understand his choices, she said finally. It makes me realize that his way of living isn't something that happened to him. It's something he chose deliberately. Is that better or worse? I think it's more complicated. It means he's not a victim of circumstances, but it also means he genuinely prefers solitude to society. That's difficult to understand for someone like me, who's always lived as part of a community. Lily was quiet for a moment, turning her carved swallow over in her small hands. But maybe he wasn't choosing solitude instead of community. Maybe he was choosing honesty instead of pretending. The observation cut straight to the heart of Vivian's confusion. The revelation about Nathaniel's wealth had forced her to confront her own assumptions, not just about him, but about the nature of choice itself. She had been operating under the belief that people's circumstances determined their options, but Nathaniel's situation suggested something far more complex, that sometimes people chose difficult paths precisely because those paths offered something more valuable than comfort or social approval. The next morning brought Martha Henderson, bristling with righteous indignation about the town's sudden shift in attitude toward that mountain man. The hypocrisy is absolutely shameful, she declared, settling herself in Vivian's parlor with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy denunciation. Yesterday, he was unsuitable company for decent people, and today every man in town is suddenly eager to make his acquaintance. It's disgraceful. For once, Vivian found herself in complete agreement with Martha's assessment, though probably not for the reasons her visitor intended. I assume you'll be maintaining appropriate distance despite this new information, Martha continued. Wealth acquired through inheritance is quite different from wealth earned through proper endeavor, and a man who chooses to live like a savage, despite having the means for civilization, clearly lacks the judgment necessary for polite society. Actually, Martha, I think it shows remarkable strength of character, Vivian replied, surprised by her own certainty. It takes considerable courage to live according to your own values when those values contradict social expectations. Martha's teacup rattled against its saucer. Vivian Ashford, surely you cannot be suggesting that eccentric behavior becomes admirable simply because someone has money. I'm suggesting that choosing a simple life when you could afford luxury demonstrates a clarity about what truly matters that I find refreshing. The conversation ended with Martha's departure in a state of barely controlled outrage, but Vivian felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since James's death, she had defended a position based on her own judgment, rather than social expectation, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would visit Nathaniel, not to congratulate him on his hidden wealth or to apologize for the town's sudden change in attitude, but to understand how someone found the strength to live so authentically in a world that rewarded conformity. The walk to his cabin felt different this time, charged with new awareness of the choices involved in every step up the mountain path. She was not visiting a poor hermit who might need her charity or pity. She was seeking conversation with someone who had deliberately chosen a path that defied conventional wisdom about success and happiness. The revelation came through Timothy Garrett, who arrived at Vivian's door on a crisp December morning carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with profound confusion. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to speak with you about something extraordinary," he began without preamble, settling himself in the parlor with unusual urgency. "Yesterday, I was at the county courthouse researching property boundaries for my father's ranch expansion when I discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Nathaniel Cross." Vivian set down her teacup, noting the unusual intensity in Timothy's voice. "What sort of discovery?" Timothy opened his satchel and withdrew a collection of official-looking documents. Property deeds, mineral rights assessments, geological surveys, all bearing Nathaniel's name. "Mrs. Ashford, that mountain hermit owns more than 3,000 acres of prime territory, including the richest silver deposits in the entire region." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Vivian stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had assumed about Nathaniel's circumstances. "Are you certain these are accurate?" "I had the clerk verify them twice," Timothy replied, spreading the papers across her coffee table. "According to these records, Nathaniel inherited the land from his late wife's father, a mining entrepreneur who discovered the silver deposits but died before they could be properly developed. The geological surveys estimate the value at somewhere approaching $500,000. $500,000. The sum was staggering, particularly when contrasted with the simple cabin, the hand-carved furniture, the herbs gathered from mountain meadows. Vivian thought of her careful calculations about security and financial stability, about the necessity of choosing a husband who could provide adequate material support. "But he lives so simply," she murmured, more to herself than to Timothy. "That's what makes this so extraordinary," Timothy continued, his young face animated with the implications. "He's choosing to live as he does. It's not poverty or failure that drove him to the mountains. It's genuine preference for that kind of life." As Timothy departed, promising to keep the discovery confidential until Vivian could decide how to proceed, she found herself grappling with a fundamental shift in perspective. The man she had begun to care for, and she could no longer deny that her feelings had moved well beyond gratitude or mere interest, was not the impoverished hermit that social convention had painted him to be. By afternoon, news of the discovery had somehow leaked into Cedar Ridge's gossip network with the kind of speed that suggested Timothy's promise of discretion had been overly optimistic. The first indication came when Bradford Morrison arrived unannounced, his demeanor noticeably different from their previous encounters. "Vivian, my dear," he began, with an oily charm that made her skin crawl. "I've just heard the most fascinating news about our mysterious mountain neighbor. Perhaps we've all been too hasty in our judgments about suitable associations." The complete reversal in his attitude would have been comical if it hadn't been so revealing of his true character. Within hours, Jerome Hartwell appeared with similar newfound enthusiasm for getting to know all members of our community better, and even Randolph Kincaid managed to discover pressing business that required him to pass by Vivian's house and share his revised thoughts about the importance of not judging by appearances. Only Charles Whitman maintained his previous position, though his reasoning proved equally troubling in its own way. "Wealth doesn't automatically confer respectability," he argued during his evening visit. "A man who chooses to live like a hermit, despite having the means for proper society, clearly suffers from some form of mental instability. Such eccentricity might be even more dangerous than simple poverty." Lily listened to these shifting allegiances with the kind of sharp attention that missed nothing important. That evening, as Vivian tucked her into bed, Her daughter asked the question that had been hovering unspoken all day. Does knowing about the money change how you feel about Mr. Cross? Vivian considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would carry weight beyond the immediate conversation. It changes how I understand his choices, she said finally. It makes me realize that his way of living isn't something that happened to him. It's something he chose deliberately. Is that better or worse? I think it's more complicated. It means he's not a victim of circumstances, but it also means he genuinely prefers solitude to society. That's difficult to understand for someone like me, who's always lived as part of a community. Lily was quiet for a moment, turning her carved swallow over in her small hands. But maybe he wasn't choosing solitude instead of community. Maybe he was choosing honesty instead of pretending. The observation cut straight to the heart of Vivian's confusion. The revelation about Nathaniel's wealth had forced her to confront her own assumptions, not just about him, but about the nature of choice itself. She had been operating under the belief that people's circumstances determined their options, but Nathaniel's situation suggested something far more complex, that sometimes people chose difficult paths precisely because those paths offered something more valuable than comfort or social approval. The next morning brought Martha Henderson, bristling with righteous indignation about the town's sudden shift in attitude toward that mountain man. The hypocrisy is absolutely shameful, she declared, settling herself in Vivian's parlor with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy denunciation. Yesterday he was unsuitable company for decent people, and today every man in town is suddenly eager to make his acquaintance. It's disgraceful. For once, Vivian found herself in complete agreement with Martha's assessment, though probably not for the reasons her visitor intended. I assume you'll be maintaining appropriate distance despite this new information, Martha continued. Wealth acquired through inheritance is quite different from wealth earned through proper endeavor, and a man who chooses to live like a savage despite having the means for civilization clearly lacks the judgment necessary for polite society. Actually, Martha, I think it shows remarkable strength of character, Vivian replied, surprised by her own certainty. It takes considerable courage to live according to your own values, when those values contradict social expectations. Martha's teacup rattled against its saucer. Vivian Ashford, surely you cannot be suggesting that eccentric behavior becomes admirable simply because someone has money. I'm suggesting that choosing a simple life when you could afford luxury demonstrates a clarity about what truly matters that I find refreshing. The conversation ended with Martha's departure in a state of barely controlled outrage, but Vivian felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since James's death, she had defended a position based on her own judgment, rather than social expectation, and the sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would visit Nathaniel, not to congratulate him on his hidden wealth or to apologize for the town's sudden change in attitude, but to understand how someone found the strength to live so authentically in a world that rewarded conformity. The walk to his cabin felt different this time, charged with new awareness of the choices involved in every step up the mountain path. She was not visiting a poor hermit who might need her charity or pity. She was seeking conversation with someone who had deliberately chosen a path that defied conventional wisdom about success and happiness. She found him in his workshop, apparently oblivious to the social upheaval his newfound status had created. In town, he looked up as she approached, his face lighting with genuine pleasure that made her heart race in ways she had forgotten were possible. "Vivian," he said simply, setting aside his tools. "I was hoping you might visit again soon. How is Lily's cough? Much improved, thanks to your remedies." She accepted his gesture toward a rough bench, but found herself too restless to sit. "Nathaniel, I need to ask you something directly." "Of course. Is it true? About the land? The silver deposits? The money?" His expression grew guarded, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then he sighed, the sound carrying years of weight. "Timothy Garrett has been busy with courthouse records." "I take it?" "He felt I should know. Everyone in town knows by now, actually. Your privacy has been thoroughly invaded." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the mountains that had sheltered him for a decade. "Yes, it's true. My father-in-law left everything to my wife, and she left it to me." "Left it to?" "I've never touched the mining rights, never developed the land for profit. It sits there waiting while I live as you see me living." "Why?" The question came out more sharply than she had intended. "Because money didn't save my family. Because wealth didn't prevent the tragedy that destroyed everything I cared about. Because I discovered that all the things I thought I needed for happiness, status, financial security, social approval, were just distractions from what actually mattered. And what actually matters: peace, purpose, the satisfaction of work, done with your own hands, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back." He met her eyes directly. "The freedom to choose love when it appears, regardless of what other people think about the wisdom of that choice." The final words hung between them with unmistakable meaning. Vivian felt her breath catch as she realized they had moved far beyond discussions of social propriety or practical considerations into territory that was both more dangerous and more honest than anything she had navigated since James's death. "Nathaniel, I know," he said gently. "I know you have obligations, expectations, a daughter to consider. I know that caring for a mountain hermit makes no practical sense. But I also know that you understand the difference between safety and happiness, even if you're not sure you have the courage to choose happiness when it means disappointing other people." The truth of his words settled over her like morning mist, clarifying shapes that had been obscured by her own fears and assumptions. She did understand that difference. She had been choosing safety at the expense of authenticity for months, and the cost was becoming unbearable. "The whole town thinks differently about you now," she said quietly. "They're all suddenly eager to make your acquaintance, to overlook your eccentricities in favor of your bank account. And what do you think?" "I think," she said slowly, "that discovering you're wealthy makes me trust my original instincts rather than doubt them. It proves that your kindness comes from genuine character rather than desperate need, and that your wisdom comes from deliberate choice rather than enforced circumstances." The smile that spread across his weathered features was like sunrise breaking over the mountain peaks. "That may be the most encouraging thing anyone has said to me in 10 years. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, they talked about choice and courage, about the difference between surviving and living, about the possibility that two people who had been broken by loss might find strength in building something new together. The conversation was both the most natural and the most important of Vivian's life, and by the time she prepared to leave, everything had changed between them. "Whatever you decide," Nathaniel said as he walked her to the forest path, "know that meeting you and Lily has reminded me that isolation was never meant to be permanent. You've shown me that healing doesn't require staying hidden forever." The walk back to town felt like a journey between worlds, from a place where authentic feeling was possible to one where social performance was required. But this time, Vivian carried with her the knowledge that authenticity was a choice rather than a luxury, and that the courage to choose love over convention might be the most practical decision she could make for both herself and her daughter. The wedding dress arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered by Agnes Caldwell with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for state occasions. It had belonged to Vivian's mother, carefully preserved in tissue paper and lavender. Sachets for more than 30 years, waiting for the day when another generation would wear it down a church aisle toward conventional happiness. "I thought it was time," Agnes announced, settling the large box on Vivian's dining room table with reverent care. Charles Whitman has been making inquiries about church availability for a spring ceremony, and proper preparations require adequate time. Vivian stared at the box as if it contained something dangerous rather than delicate lace and silk. Charles had indeed been hinting more strongly about formalization of their understanding, though she had never explicitly agreed to any such arrangement. Somehow, in the complex social calculations of Cedar Ridge society, her failure to definitively reject his suit had been interpreted as acceptance. "Agnes, I haven't actually agreed to marry Charles." "Nonsense, dear. You've been entertaining his attentions for months, and he's clearly the most suitable of your options. The dress will need minor alterations, of course. Your mother was slightly taller, but the basic structure is timeless." As Agnes carefully lifted the gown from its protective wrapping, Vivian felt the weight of expectation settling around her shoulders like a physical burden. The dress was indeed beautiful. Ivory silk with intricate beadwork and a train that spoke of romance and permanence. Her mother had worn it to marry Vivian's father in a ceremony that had satisfied every social requirement and produced a partnership that had been respectable, comfortable, and utterly passionless. "Try it on," Agnes urged. "I want to see what adjustments will be needed." The fitting process felt like a form of imprisonment. As Agnes pinned and measured, discussing bustle adjustments and hem lengths, Vivian caught sight of herself in the hall mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like a beautiful bride-to-be, but the expression in her green eyes was that of someone preparing for execution rather than celebration. "There," Agnes declared with satisfaction. "You look lovely, dear. Exactly as a prospective bride should look: elegant, appropriate, ready to assume her proper role in society." After Agnes departed with promises to return the following week with the dress properly altered, Vivian found herself still wearing the gown, unable to summon the energy to change clothes. She wandered through her house like a ghost haunting her own life, trying to imagine walking down the church aisle toward Charles Whitman and finding only emptiness where anticipation should have been. Lily appeared in the parlor doorway and stopped short at the sight of her mother in wedding attire. "Are you getting married, Mama?" People seem to think I should be. But what do you think?" The question struck to the heart of everything Vivian had been avoiding. What did she think? When had her own opinion become so secondary to social expectation that she couldn't answer her daughter's simple inquiry? "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm terrified of making the wrong choice. For both of us." Lily entered the room and settled on the sofa, studying her mother with those unnervingly perceptive grey eyes. What would be the wrong choice? Choosing security over happiness, or choosing happiness over security? Both feel dangerous. "But Mama," Lily said gently, "what if happiness is the only real security there is? What if everything else is just pretending?" That evening brought Charles Whitman for what he clearly intended as a formal proposal conversation. He arrived with flowers, dressed in his finest suit, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had every reason to expect a positive response to his carefully planned speech. Vivian received him in the parlor while still wearing her mother's wedding dress, a decision that seemed to confirm his assumptions about the evening's purpose. He settled across from her with visible satisfaction, clearly interpreting her appearance as a favorable sign. "Vivian, you look absolutely radiant," he began, his tone carrying the warmth of a man who believed himself to be addressing his future wife. "The dress is perfect for you, elegant, timeless, appropriate for a woman of your standing." "Charles, before you continue, I need to tell you something. Please let me speak first." He leaned forward with the earnestness of someone who had rehearsed this moment extensively. "I've given considerable thought to our future together, and I believe we could build something truly substantial, a partnership that would benefit not only ourselves, but our entire community." He outlined his vision with the thoroughness of a business proposal, The combining of their properties, the advantages for Lily's education and social development, the respect they would command as an established couple, the security that would come from their unified financial position. Everything he said was reasonable, practical, and utterly soul-destroying. "You would be an excellent wife for a man in my position," he concluded, "and I believe I could provide the stability and guidance that you and Lily need during this difficult transition in your lives." The phrase, "wife for a man in my position," echoed in Vivian's mind with particular starkness. Not a beloved partner, not a cherished companion, but a suitable accessory to his social and business ambitions. "Charles," she said carefully, "your proposal is very generous, and I'm honored by your confidence in our compatibility. But I need more time to consider." "Time?" His expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of irritation quickly suppressed. "Vivian, we've been moving toward this understanding for months. What additional consideration could be necessary?" The question hung in the air between them, and Vivian realized that for Charles, her acceptance was not just expected, but already assumed. The proposal was a formality, a social nicety required before announcing arrangements that had already been decided in his mind. "I need to be certain that marriage would serve Lily's best interests as well as our own," she said diplomatically. "Lily's interests are best served by stability, proper guidance, and introduction to the social connections that will benefit her future prospects. These things cannot be provided by alternative arrangements." The pointed reference to Nathaniel was unmistakable, though Charles was too diplomatic to name him directly. But his meaning was clear: choose conventional respectability or forfeit any claim to community support for her daughter's future. After Charles departed, his confidence only slightly shaken by her request for additional time, Vivian remained in the parlor, still wearing the wedding dress that felt increasingly like a costume for a role she had never auditioned to play. Lily reappeared, this time carrying her wooden horse and the carved swallow, settling beside her mother on the sofa with the air of someone prepared for serious conversation. "Mr. Whitman wants to marry you," she observed. "Yes, he does, but you don't want to marry him." Vivian looked down at her daughter, surprised once again by the child's ability to see through adult complications to essential truths. "How can you tell?" "Because when you talk about him, you sound like you're discussing business arrangements. When you talk about Mr. Cross, you sound like you're talking about someone you actually like." The observation was devastating in its simplicity and accuracy. Vivian had indeed been treating Charles's proposal like a business transaction, weighing practical advantages against social requirements, while her conversations about Nathaniel carried emotional weight that she had been afraid to acknowledge. "Liking someone and marrying them are two different things, sweetheart. Marriage requires considering many factors beyond personal preference." "Like what?" "Like security, social acceptance, what's best for your future." "But what if what's best for my future is having a mother who's happy?" Lily interrupted gently. "What if watching you pretend to be someone you're not teaches me that authenticity doesn't matter as much as other people's approval?" The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. In all her careful calculations about providing Lily with the best possible future, she had never considered what kind of lesson she might be teaching about the relative importance of truth versus convenience. "Mama," Lily continued, her voice carrying wisdom that seemed to come from some deep well of understanding, "I've been thinking about what Mr. Cross said about courage, about choosing love when it appears even if other people think it's unwise. Maybe the unwise thing isn't choosing love. Maybe the unwise thing is choosing fear instead." That night, as Vivian finally removed her mother's wedding dress and hung it carefully in her wardrobe, she found herself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance parents left their children. Her mother had left her a beautiful dress and the expectation that marriage should be approached as a practical arrangement between compatible partners. But what legacy was she preparing to leave Lily? She thought about Nathaniel, alone in his mountain cabin, who had chosen authenticity over social approval and found peace in that choice. She thought about the way her heart had begun to heal during their conversations, how Lily blossomed in his presence, how natural it felt to imagine a life built around genuine affection rather than social obligation. But she also thought about the very real consequences of defying community expectations, the gossip, the social isolation, the potential impact on Lily's future prospects. In a place like Cedar Ridge, where reputation determined everything, from business opportunities to marriage possibilities, choosing the unconventional path carried risks that extended far beyond her own happiness. As she prepared for bed, Vivian caught sight of herself in the mirror, no longer wearing the wedding dress, no longer playing the role of dutiful widow, considering her practical options. Just herself, a woman of 32 who had loved deeply once and might have the courage to love authentically again if she could find the strength to trust her own judgment over the collective wisdom of people who had never faced her particular. At crossroads, the choice before her was becoming clear, even if the courage to make it remained elusive. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new arguments for choosing safety over uncertainty, but tonight, for the first time in months, Vivian allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to follow her heart instead of her fears, to choose the path that led toward genuine happiness rather than mere respectability. The wooden swallow sat on her bedside table, wings spread in eternal flight toward some distant destination that required faith rather than certainty to reach. Outside her window, the mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and somewhere in those hills lived a man who understood both the pain of devastating loss and the possibility of unexpected healing. The time for choosing was approaching, and Vivian finally understood that the choice was not between security and happiness, but between fear and courage, between living someone else's version of her life and creating one that honored her own deepest truths. The morning of what would have been her wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made Cedar Ridge look like something painted on china. Vivian woke to find Lily sitting on the floor beside her bed, weaving wildflowers into a small bouquet with the careful concentration that she brought to all meaningful tasks. "Good morning, sweetheart," Vivian said, noting the determined set of her daughter's jaw. "What are you making?" "Something real," Lily replied without looking up from her work. "Something that grows wild and strong instead of something that someone thinks is supposed to be pretty." The bouquet was indeed beautiful in its simplicity, mountain asters and late-blooming columbines, hearty flowers that had survived the first frost through sheer determination. They bore no resemblance to the elaborate arrangements that Charles had envisioned for their ceremony, but they possessed an authenticity that made Vivian's heart ache with recognition. Downstairs, the kitchen table was set with the finest china and silver, prepared by Agnes Caldwell, who had arrived before dawn to oversee the pre-wedding breakfast. The house filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee, and everything should have felt festive and celebratory. Instead, the atmosphere carried the weight of impending execution. "The seamstress delivered the dress last evening," Agnes announced. As Vivian entered the kitchen, "The alterations are perfect. You'll look absolutely radiant walking down that aisle." But Vivian was staring out the kitchen window toward the mountains, her mind filled with an image of Nathaniel's cabin and the peace she had found in conversations that honored truth over convenience. Somewhere in those hills lived a man who had chosen authenticity over approval, who understood the weight of loss and the possibility of healing, who had looked at her with recognition rather than calculation. "Mrs. Ashford," Agnes continued, apparently oblivious to Vivian's distraction, "you should begin preparing soon. The ceremony is scheduled for 2 o'clock, and proper preparation requires adequate time." "Agnes," Vivian said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even herself, "there isn't going to be a ceremony. The words fell into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to spread outward through the very foundations of the house. Agnes dropped her wooden spoon, and even Lily looked up from her wildflower bouquet with wide eyes. "What did you say?" "I said there isn't going to be a wedding. I can't marry Charles Whitman. I won't marry him." Agnes's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested apoplexy was imminent. "Vivian Ashford, you cannot be serious. The church is prepared. The guests are expecting. Charles arranged everything without asking what I actually wanted," Vivian replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "He assumed my agreement because I was too frightened to voice my disagreement, but I'm not frightened anymore." "Not frightened?" Agnes's voice rose toward hysteria. "You should be terrified. Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation, to your standing in this community, to Lily's future prospects?" Lily looked up from her flowers, her small face serious but not alarmed. "Will it hurt us, Mama, making a different choice?" The question was asked with such simple trust that Vivian felt her remaining doubts dissolve like morning mist. Her daughter wasn't afraid of social disapproval or financial uncertainty. She was only concerned about whether courage would bring consequences that love couldn't overcome. "I don't know, sweetheart," Vivian said honestly, "but I know that living a lie would hurt us more in the long run." Agnes began what promised to be a lengthy lecture about social obligations and practical considerations, but Vivian was no longer listening. Instead, she was thinking about the packet of wildflower seeds sitting in her kitchen drawer, about the possibility of planting something that would grow strong precisely because it was suited to difficult conditions. "I need to speak with Charles," she announced, cutting across Agnes's increasingly frantic predictions of social ruin. "He deserves to hear this from me directly, and he deserves to hear it before he arrives at the church." The walk to Charles's house felt like the longest journey of Vivian's life, even though it covered less than 6 blocks through familiar streets. By the time she reached his front door, word of her rebellion had somehow spread through the town's gossip network, and she could feel curious eyes watching from windows and doorways. Charles received her in his parlor, already dressed in his wedding suit, his face wearing the expression of a man who had been prepared for triumph and found himself facing disaster instead. The conversation was brief and devastating, not because Charles showed unexpected emotion, but because he showed so little. "I see," he said when she had finished explaining her decision. "This is about the mountain man, I assume." "This is about choosing authenticity over convenience," Vivian replied. "This is about refusing to build a life on foundations that ignore what I actually need for happiness." Charles nodded slowly, his expression more irritated than heartbroken. "I hope you understand the consequences of this choice, Vivian. Social disapproval has a way of lasting far longer than romantic infatuation." As she walked back through town, past neighbors who whispered behind curtains and former friends who studied her with expressions ranging from pity to outright condemnation, Vivian carried Lily's wildflower bouquet and felt, for the first time in months, that she was finally walking in the right direction. The climb to Nathaniel's cabin had never felt longer or more necessary. Vivian's practical boots found purchase on the familiar path, while her heart hammered against her ribs with the rhythm of someone approaching either salvation or complete destruction. Lily walked beside her, clutching the wildflower bouquet with the solemnity of someone bearing a sacred offering. They had left Cedar Ridge in a state of barely controlled chaos. Word of the cancelled wedding had spread through the town like wildfire, and by the time they departed, clusters of neighbors had gathered on porches and street corners to discuss the scandal in hushed, urgent tones. Martha Henderson had made one final desperate attempt to change Vivian's mind, arriving at the house with Bradford Morrison and Jerome Hartwell in tow, all three prepared to deliver impassioned speeches about social responsibility and practical considerations. But Vivian had listened to their arguments with the calm detachment of someone who had finally moved beyond the reach of other people's fears. Their words seemed to come from a great distance, like voices calling across a canyon that had already been crossed. "You're making the greatest mistake of your life," Bradford had declared, his face red with indignation. "That mountain hermit will never be able to provide you with the security and status you deserve. Status derived from other people's approval isn't worth having," Vivian had replied quietly. "And security that requires me to abandon my own judgment isn't really security at all." Now, as the forest path wound higher into the hills, those confrontations felt like something that had happened to someone else. With each step away from Cedar Ridge, Vivian felt layers of social pretense falling away like discarded clothes, until only her essential self remained, a woman who had loved deeply, lost tragically, and found the courage to love again, despite the risks involved. The sound of chopping wood echoed through the trees as they approached the clearing, steady and rhythmic as always. But when Nathaniel looked up from his work and saw them approaching, something in his expression suggested he had been expecting their arrival, as if he had somehow sensed the momentous decision that had brought them to his doorstep. "Vivian," he said simply, setting aside his axe and moving toward them with the careful attention of someone who understood that important moments required gentle handling. "Lily, we brought you flowers," Lily announced, stepping forward to present her. Wildflower bouquet with ceremonial gravity. "Mama said they were for new beginnings." Nathaniel accepted the offering with the reverence it deserved, examining each flower as if it were a precious jewel. "They're perfect," he said seriously. "Wild things that grow strong precisely because they're suited to difficult conditions." The parallel was not lost on any of them. Vivian felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and understood after months of careful performance for audiences who had never bothered to look beneath the surface. "I called off the wedding," she said, the words emerging more easily than she had expected. "I couldn't go through with marrying someone I didn't love, building a life based on other people's expectations rather than my own truth." Nathaniel's response was characteristic in its directness. Instead of asking about her decision or expressing concern about its consequences, he simply stepped closer and took her hands in his work-roughened fingers. "Are you frightened?" he asked gently. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of the choice itself, only of whether I'm strong enough to live with the consequences." "You are," he said with quiet certainty. "You've already proven that by getting this far." They talked for hours in the clearing, while afternoon light filtered through the pines, and Lily played contentedly with the wood shavings near Nathaniel's workshop. The conversation ranged from practical matters, how they might build a life together that honored both their needs, to deeper questions about healing, family, and the possibility of creating something beautiful from the pieces of broken dreams. "I have to tell you something," Nathaniel said as evening approached. "Yesterday, before I knew about your decision, I started a carving project that I hadn't expected to begin for years, if ever." He disappeared into his workshop and returned with a piece of wood that was barely begun, but already showed signs of becoming something extraordinary. "It's going to be a family portrait," he explained, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made Vivian's heart race. 3 figures, 2 adults and a child, standing together, but each maintaining their individual strength. Lily peered at the carving with intense interest. "Will it show us as we really are, or as people think we should be?" "As you really are," Nathaniel promised solemnly. "That's the only kind of portrait worth making." As they prepared to return to town, to face whatever consequences awaited them, Nathaniel surprised them both with a request that seemed to emerge from some deep well of hope he had long kept hidden. "Would you consider, that is, if the idea appeals to you, building a new beginning here in these mountains? not hiding from the world, but creating a life that serves our actual needs rather than other people's expectations. Vivian looked around the clearing, imagining it not as a retreat from civilization, but as a foundation for something entirely new. A place where love could grow according to its own natural patterns, where Lily could learn that authenticity was more valuable than approval, where two people who had been broken by loss could discover that healing sometimes led to joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I think that appeals to us very much indeed." 6 months later, the carved wooden sign that hung beside the forest path read, "The Cross Ashford Ranch," in letters that had been shaped with infinite patience and love. Below the words, Nathaniel had carved a small swallow in flight, its wings spread toward some distant horizon that no longer seemed impossible to reach. The transformation of the mountain clearing had been gradual but profound. Where once a solitary cabin had stood, a small homestead now flourished. The original structure expanded with careful additions that maintained its rustic character while accommodating the needs of a family. A proper garden plot had been cleared and planted with both practical vegetables and Vivian's beloved wildflowers, creating a harmony between necessity and beauty that seemed to capture the essence of their new life together. Lily had adapted to mountain living with the resilience that children brought to most adventures. Her cough, which had plagued her for months in town, had disappeared entirely in the clean mountain air, and she had developed an impressive knowledge of local flora and fauna under Nathaniel's patient tutelage. More importantly, she had blossomed into the confident, curious child she had always been meant to become, free from the social constraints that had required her to diminish herself for adult comfort. "Mama, come see what I found!" she called from the edge of the clearing, where she had been exploring with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who understood that the wilderness held wonders rather than dangers. Vivian looked up from the letter. She had been writing correspondence with a publisher in Denver who had expressed interest in Nathaniel's philosophical writings, and followed her daughter's voice to where Lily knelt beside a cluster of early spring flowers. "Bleeding hearts," Nathaniel said, appearing beside them with the silent grace he had perfected during his years of solitude. "They're the first flowers to bloom after winter, even when there's still snow on the ground." "They're beautiful," Lily observed, studying the delicate pink blossoms with scientific interest. "And they have such a sad name for something so pretty." "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest sorrows," Nathaniel replied gently, his hand finding Vivian's as they knelt together in the mountain meadow. "Sometimes what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of something entirely new." The wisdom in his words carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond botanical observation. Their unconventional family had indeed grown from loss: Nathaniel's devastating tragedy, Vivian's widowhood, Lily's grief for her father. But what had emerged from that shared understanding of sorrow was stronger and more authentic than anything. Built on easier foundations, the town of Cedar Ridge had eventually adjusted to their choice, though the process had been neither quick nor painless. Some neighbors had maintained their disapproval, crossing streets to avoid encounters and ensuring that social invitations no longer included the Ashford name. But others had surprised Vivian with their support, particularly Timothy Garrett, who had become a regular visitor to their mountain home and had recently begun courting a young woman who valued his kindness over his social position. Even Martha Henderson had grudgingly admitted that Lily appeared to be thriving in her unconventional circumstances, though she continued to express concern about the child's irregular education. This concern had been addressed when Nathaniel's former university colleagues learned of his situation and began sending advanced texts and correspondence courses that challenged Lily's considerable intellect in ways that conventional schooling never could have achieved. "I received a response from the editor today," Vivian mentioned as they walked back toward the cabin, Lily running ahead to check on the chickens that had become her particular responsibility. "He wants to publish your..." essay on education and authenticity in the autumn edition, Nathaniel's step faltered slightly. Despite his years of academic writing, the prospect of returning to public intellectual discourse still carried emotional weight. "Are you certain it's ready?" "I'm certain it's important," Vivian replied firmly. "Your insights about learning versus performance, about nurturing natural curiosity instead of forcing artificial compliance. These ideas could help other families choose authenticity over convention." The conversation continued as they prepared the evening meal together, a process that had become one of their favorite daily rituals. Unlike the formal dinner service that had characterized Vivian's previous life, these meals were collaborative. Affairs where everyone contributed according to their abilities and inclinations. Lily set the table with wildflowers from her garden. Nathaniel provided fish from the mountain stream, and Vivian contributed bread baked in the oven he had built into the cabin's expanded kitchen. As they sat down to eat, the late spring sunlight, streaming through windows that faced both the valley below and the peaks above, Vivian found herself thinking about the different kinds of inheritance she was now preparing to leave her daughter. Instead of social expectations and conventional wisdom about security, Lily would receive something far more valuable: the knowledge that authentic love was worth fighting for, that courage could transform fear into strength, and that families could be built on truth rather than convenience. "Mama," Lily said suddenly, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that always preceded important observations, "do you think Daddy would have liked Mr. Cross?" The question might have been painful in their previous life, but here, in their mountain sanctuary, it felt like a natural bridge between past and present. "I think your father would have appreciated anyone who made us genuinely happy," Vivian replied honestly. "And I think he would have understood that love isn't diminished by being shared, it's multiplied." Nathaniel reached across the table to cover her hand with his, the gesture carrying years of careful healing and growing trust. "I hope someday to earn the honor of following in his footsteps as a father to you, Lily, not to replace what you lost, but to add something new to what you already carry in your heart." "You already have," Lily said simply, her matter-of-fact tone suggesting that adult concerns about such transitions were largely unnecessary. "Love doesn't have to be complicated. People just make it complicated when they're afraid." As evening settled over their mountain home, the family gathered on the porch to watch stars emerge in a sky unmarred by town lights. The carved family portrait that Nathaniel had been working on for months sat nearly finished on his workbench, its three figures standing together in poses that captured both individual strength and collective belonging. The woman in the carving stood with her head raised toward distant horizons, her hand resting on the shoulder of a child whose face reflected curiosity rather than constraint. Beside them, a man held tools that spoke of honest work and creative purpose, his expression peaceful rather than driven. It was a family portrait that honored what they had actually become rather than what others thought they should be. Sometimes, Vivian reflected as she watched her daughter point out constellations, with the confidence of someone who understood that the universe held infinite possibilities. The most courageous thing you could do was trust that authenticity would prove stronger than safety, that love grown in difficult conditions would survive storms that destroyed more conventional foundations. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate with the kind of uncomplicated honesty that had become the foundation of their new life together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices, but tonight there was only contentment, the deep satisfaction of people who had chosen truth over convenience and discovered that happiness was indeed the only security worth having.